which is a local consulting firm specializing in transportation planning and modeling for non-motorized modes. She is a nationally recognized expert on bicycle and pedestrian safety, travel behavior, and planning for public health. Her research has been recognized by the Transportation Research Board, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, and the Institute of Transportation Engineers. We'll also be passing around some sign-up sheets for the continuing education credits, so if you don't get it through here, then come up at the end and we'll get you signed in. Thanks.
Okay, if any of you know me, there's no way I'm going to be able to stand in front of this microphone to give my whole presentation because I'm way too off the wall for that. So I apologize in advance. If you can't hear me, speak up so that I know to keep the microphone in front of my face. Thank you all for coming. I know this is the last session of the day, and so I will try not to keep you here for a full hour and a half, but I hope I'll make it worth your time so that you don't regret staying for the last session of the day. As Caitlin mentioned, today we're going to talk about kind of a culmination of a number of different projects that I've been working on with UDOT's safety division, looking at bicycle and pedestrian safety with regard to intersection design. This research has been ongoing for, the better part of about 5 years now, and so we've started to get some pretty solid statistics and some good results coming out of the data, and I'm going to go over all of that today. So active transportation in Utah. I can honestly say that when I started in this market in 2005, I was kind of one of the lone voices. I worked for Envision Utah at the time, and most of the consulting firms didn't even have someone that specialized in bicycle and pedestrian. They had someone who was kind of assigned to it in passing, and I would say maybe 1 or 2 cities, Park City and Salt Lake City, were the only ones in the entire state that were really even thinking about bicycle and pedestrian issues. Well, fast forward 10 years, and there's a lot going on. It's been gaining momentum, and we're hitting that tipping point where, the stone is rolling down the hill and it can't be stopped, which I think is a great thing, because the more we have interest and the more people get involved, the higher quality of the work that typically comes out. So some of the projects that have been going on, I'm sure many of you are aware of these, but we've had the UCATS project that's now on phase 2. The UTA did their first and last mile study looking at non-motorized connectivity to transit. We've had the impacts of active transportation study, which was just barely funded, and that's kind of a group effort by UTA, UDOT, WFRC MAG, and Bike Utah, and probably 10 other groups that I am failing to mention. I know Utah Department of Health is in on that one as well. There are a lot of shared solutions initiatives. I don't know how many of you have attended any of the presentations on the West Davis Corridor, which is kind of North Legacy through Davis County. They're currently looking at a shared solutions option with that highway project that would incorporate a large number of bike ped innovations and treatments to kind of offset the vehicle demand. Additionally, we've had a lot, the arrival, if you will, of the Health and Transportation Summit, which is going on either its 3rd or 4th year. Just recently had that conference in the fall. And then we also have had a number of local bicycle and pedestrian master plans that have been, it seems like they've kind of been marching up the Wasatch Front over the last 3 or 4 years, which is a good thing, because not only are we doing good things within cities, but these plans allow us to improve connectivity between the cities and really promote walking and biking as alternative modes of transportation. So I do still want to point out kind of the elephant in the room, that our transportation systems are designed for cars, not for cyclists and pedestrians, and most areas still barely accommodate them. Just because a city has a master plan for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure doesn't necessarily mean that when you travel through that city on the ground that it's user-friendly or useful. And so we need to be aware of that even though a lot of great things are happening, we still have quite a long way to go before our region becomes, Boulder or Portland or some of these other, cycling and walking meccas. And I think it wouldn't be far-pressed to say that we're never going to have the walking mecca that you get along the East Coast in the higher density, older cities where they were planned and designed and built before the invent of the automobile. It's just, we live out west, it's a different environment, and so we have to plan a little bit differently, and things just exist on the ground here in a different way. But you can see, things here get done piecemeal. This is a prime example. When we develop a vacant tract of land, then curb, gutter, sidewalk typically kind of follows with that process. But that leaves sections like this where we have a great shoulder for a cyclist until you get to the undeveloped portion, and then I don't know how many of you really would like to try to bike that. This is at the frontage road in Centerville, between Centerville and Farmington in Davis County. Speed limit 50 miles an hour. So again, do you want to get on your bike tire and take your life in your hands to ride that stretch of road on a 9.5, 10-foot lane? You know, it's kind of scary. This is also listed on a Safe Routes to School map for K through 6, Reading Elementary. Again, we have lovely things on the books. Look, we have a Safe Routes to School map. It's the safe way for the kids to travel. My nieces and nephews go to that school. I would not let my kids walk to school to save my life on that street. 50-mile-an-hour traffic, which means the cars are usually going 60, 65, especially right here because you're usually going faster on this road than on I-15, especially at rush hour. So again, safety, it's good to have these plans, but we need to be looking at things from a safety output. And then how frequently do we see these kinds of conditions? We have a lovely sidewalk that's so overgrown and unusable. That's great if you're 6 and you're walking to a friend's house, but if you're someone with a disability that's in a wheelchair, suddenly that sidewalk's not so user-friendly or safe. Or, you know, if you're a mom pushing a stroller, suddenly it might be a little bit problematic. So let's talk about some of these things. So we have a lot of good things happening, but sometimes I worry that in our region we may be putting the cart before the horse just a tiny, tiny bit. We are doing good things. For example, why Salt Lake City chose to build the very first protected intersection for bicycling in the United States. This article just came out on September 30th. There's been a ton of notoriety about the great things that are happening in Salt Lake City, but sometimes we need to discuss, is this the best option? It's great, it's beautiful. You know, if you're a cyclist, you wish every road looked like this and every intersection looked like this, and wouldn't it be wonderful? But are we building so that people will start biking more, or are we building to accommodate? Because I can tell you, when I read the article on KSL and on the Tribune, most of the comments, I'd say 90% of the comments, were people trashing that lovely intersection treatment, saying that now it's a nightmare to drive through. Because most of the people in that area are still driving, and so to them, it's a waste of money and it's a waste of infrastructure. Increased volumes, so if we build this as to induce demand, if we build these types of things so more people will feel comfortable walking and cycling, then as we increase those volumes, we increase risk. Because as we all know from a transportation analysis standpoint, that the more exposure you have, the greater your risk to be involved in a crash or to have an altercation with a vehicle, etc. So given that, if this is what we want to become and if this is what we want to promote, we need to do it in a way that we're also taking into account safety as we go. Because we want to make sure that we're not building infrastructure that then throws our safety out the window, and now suddenly we have an increase in pedestrian and cyclist fatalities because suddenly we have these great bike lanes, but are they really safer and do they really make a difference? So we're going to talk a little bit about what the data says today. So first of all, what makes cyclists and pedestrians more vulnerable? You know, there's the obvious, like, well, duh, you're not hiding inside of a car. You don't have that protective barrier that makes, you safer when you're driving. Are you safer in a smart car or in a Suburban? Obviously, you're probably safer in a crash in the Suburban because there's more material between you and the other vehicle. Demographics is one of our big ones that we always talk about. People under the age of 18 or over the age of 65 are 3 times more likely to be involved in a crash as a pedestrian or a cyclist on the younger end of the spectrum. So we know that the very young and the very old are much more vulnerable, and we typically refer to them as our vulnerable road users. Also, people with disabilities who are captive and reliant on active modes of transportation. Physical environment makes us more vulnerable. Yes? Again, it's kind of the chicken and the egg problem where there are more, and we'll get into that when I talk about the data from the research. In certain areas, the higher percentage of young people does not make a difference. You'd think, oh, well, an area around a school would obviously be more dangerous because there's more children present, but not so. The data that we've analyzed doesn't show that, except for in a few specific cases, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. But again, physical environment, if this is a good example, there's no crosswalk here, there's no light, and so a lot of the times the cars blow right through that crossing, but yet you still have pedestrians trying to cross. And so our built environment has a big impact. Travel behavior. The reason that you choose, if you're a cyclist, why do you choose the routes that you choose? There's a lot of social psychology that goes into our travel behavior that can make us also more vulnerable to being in crashes. If you're a very hesitant cyclist and you're not comfortable riding in traffic, but yet it's the only road to get from point A to point B, you may not be as comfortable, which then your anxiety impacts the decision-making process, and it can make you become at a higher increased risk to get in a crash just because you're not comfortable. You may cut out in front of cars because you don't have that experience level. There's also driver travel behavior. How much experience do our drivers have dealing with cyclists on the road? Every time there's a fatality with a pedestrian or a cyclist, the message boards blow up with drivers saying, well, the cyclist shouldn't have been on the road. They were riding in the middle of the lane. And then you get the cyclists saying, well, the cars buzz past you going 50 miles an hour and they don't give you the 3 feet that they're required. And so there's a different sense of perception from drivers versus cyclists or pedestrians. Lastly, attitudes and opinions. Again, it gets back into what is your life experience? What perspective do you come from when you start thinking about biking or walking? If you're a competitive cyclist and you're doing century rides every single weekend, your attitude about infrastructure, riding in traffic, being around cars, being on the streets is going to be very, very different than a mom who wants her kids to be able to ride their bikes to school safely and their perceptions of traffic. The mom probably wants the separated right-of-way 10-foot path, whereas a lot of our road cyclists say they don't even want bike lanes because they don't want to be confined to the bike lane. They want to be able to ride in the street where there's not all the garbage and the gravel and the glass and everything else. Yeah. It kind of runs across the board. There's a higher rate of crashes with young kids, but the fatality rate is actually higher for older adults. And a lot of that, again, gets into all of these factors. It's the travel behavior and the attitudes. Typically kids get into accidents when they dart out into traffic or in those kinds of situations. And a lot of times kids are riding on residential streets where the speed limits are lower, and more active adults are out on the higher volume streets. But it kind of runs across the board, and I have the data. We're going to go over that in just a minute as a part of this session. But the key thing that we're going to talk about today is this physical environment, because I have a PhD in actual travel behavior analysis. That's what my degree is in. So I spent way too many years to count studying why people make decisions about travel. And let me tell you, that's a tough nut to crack, because everyone comes from such different backstory and different life experience that when you try to say, I'm going to change the way you make a decision about traveling, or I'm going to help you change the route you choose, or why is it that my parents, when they have to run to a neighbor's house, get in the car and drive 5 houses down the street? Yeah. There's a psychology to it, and that's really, really difficult. And I wouldn't expect engineers to try to change behavior through the travel behavior side of things. But we can impact travel behavior by changing the physical environment and the environment that people experience. Because by making the environment safer, you're going to change behavior by default. So some of the past research that we've done, and what I'm going to get into detail on today is phase 3 of this research project. The first phase was done in 2011, and it looked at Salt Lake County. And we looked at the top 10 most dangerous intersections for bicyclists and pedestrians. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on phase 1 and phase 2 because I've presented the results of those at the last 2-3 years at this conference. And if any of you have attended that, I don't want to bore you to death by going over all of the same things. But the first year we did Salt Lake County, and we found the top 10 most dangerous intersections, and then 10 very low risk intersections that were comparable in design, size, volume, etc., to try to figure out what made those dangerous intersections more dangerous. Why is it that 4700 South Redwood Road, why is that such a dangerous place for pedestrians and cyclists? How is that road any different than another intersection that looks just like it? What are the key components that make it dangerous? Then our second phase, we got out of our urban core and we looked at the suburban areas along the Wasatch Front. We analyzed Weber, Davis, and Utah counties, and again found the top 10 most dangerous intersections for each county, and looked at what is it about those intersections, and are they different than the ones in the urban core? If we're looking at an intersection in West Valley City that has the exact same characteristics as one in Davis County, do they have the same crash risk or crash rating, or are they different? And does that have to do with the travel behavior of the people in the different counties? We really wanted to boil this down to figure out how can we get at the root of the problem so that we can improve safety. Today I'm going to talk about phase 3, and this is where we got off of the Wasatch Front and into what we term the rural counties, but obviously, there are parts of Washington County and Tooele and Cache that aren't very rural. We've got downtowns and we've got kind of more typical suburban development, but for the sake of the research, it was urban core, suburban, and then kind of the rest of the state, if you will. And the methods that we used, again, intersection classification. We went through with using UDOT crash data and data from the Office of Highway Safety to identify clusters of high risk for pedestrians and cyclists, areas that had very high concentrations within 100 meters of an intersection. The way that crashes are cataloged at the site of an accident, if the crash happens, you'll understand this from a GIS aggregating standpoint, is we may have a crash right here, or if someone's trying to jaywalk here, if someone's in the crosswalk here, and here, and here. We wanted to aggregate all of those around the same intersection so that we knew what we were looking at, and if you do a point analysis, that's not necessarily easy to do. So we aggregated within 100 meters of the intersection so that we would catch all of those tiny little points that may have variation, and then made ourselves a nice little list of the top 10 most dangerous intersections for each county. We have in that crash data the age of the pedestrian or cyclist involved in the crash, time of day, accident severity, all of those characteristics that went along with the crash itself, so that we could analyze, maybe certain intersection characteristics make crashes more fatal than others. So maybe it's not necessarily a characteristic that makes you have more crashes, but there are more serious crashes because of a certain characteristic, and so we wanted to be able to analyze that as well. Then we went out and did an inventory of site characteristics for each of these intersections, and that included characteristics of the transportation system. So how many lanes? What's the roadway width? What is the signal layout? What's the signal timing? Are there ped head crossings? Is there a countdown box? Is there a crosswalk? Is there a mid-block crossing? Do we have, pedestrian refuges in the middle, so that if you get halfway across, do you have somewhere to stop, or are you playing, freeway like the old Atari game, trying to run across and dodge cars as you go? So all of that was cataloged. Then we got into the built environment, which included things such as building setback, the presence of street trees, the width of the sidewalks, all of those types of characteristics. Land use, so is it residential, commercial, industrial, mixed use, etc. And then some other data. And you can see the characteristics. Here's kind of a summary of the characteristics that we use. So for our transportation system, we looked at speed limit, level of service. In the first phase for Salt Lake County, because Wasatch Front Regional Council had the data sets, we also included 2 different indices of bicycle friendliness. So there was the bicycle friendliness index, they calculated, and then there's also a bicycle compatibility index. And so we ran both of those through our analysis as well to try to figure out, are roads that have been identified as bicycle friendly actually safer? And I'm not going to go over that today, but in hindsight, the answer is no. Bikes that are roadways that are classified as friendly according to a bicycle compatibility index are actually more dangerous for cyclists than ones that are cataloged low on the BCI index. So you can see all of these characteristics for the first 2 phases, so Salt Lake County and then the rest of the Wasatch Front. all of the final reports are on the UDOT website. So if you want to read all of the statistical analysis and the details from those two areas, they're available online. Then the statistical analysis methods, for those of you who like to geek out on math like I do, we used some independent samples t-tests just to compare high-risk versus low-risk intersections. And then we got into our regression analysis, negative binomial models, and some binary logit fun things. And in all of the models that I ran, we controlled for demographics. So again, that way we were able to say, you know, if it's an area where there's a lot of young kids, we wanted to make sure that we weren't just capturing that there were a lot of young kids, and that was why the rate was higher. We wanted to actually control those out so that we could identify the built environment characteristics that were making the difference. And we also ran all of the models in a stepwise fashion so that if one variable was significant because it was interrelated to another variable, so that those kinds of things. And you'll see in the models, so for example, number of lanes and roadway width, those two things are correlated, because if you have more lanes, the road is going to be wider. And so we controlled for that within the model so that we could actually say, no, it's the number of lanes and not just the fact that the roadway is 500 feet. And so we could actually get down into the minutia of the statistical significance. So phase one, just to review what the significant correlates were, we get into the urban core of Salt Lake County. The significant variables are listed over here on the right. Signal length was a big significant factor. The longer the green light timing, the safer the intersection was, which, you know, some of these are kind of a no-brainer. The longer you have to cross the street, obviously it's going to be safer, because if you have limited mobility, you know, if you're elderly and you're walking with a cane, or you are a little kid and your steps are, you know, 6 inches, if you have more time to cross that street, you're going to be safer. You're not going to have to run, and you're not going to get stuck, you know, sprinting to beat the countdown clock on the other side. Dedicated right turn lanes were actually proven to improve safety. And a lot of people kind of ran into a quandary with that one, because they thought right turn lanes would be more dangerous, especially a dedicated right, because you'd have people just whipping around the corner. But what it does is it gets back to travel behavior. When people see a dedicated right turn lane, they know if there's a car in that lane, they're turning right. Whereas if you have a right turn lane that's straight or right, you may be standing on the curb looking, kind of going, well, are they going to turn, or are they going to go straight? Are they going to turn? Oh, well, they're slowing down, so maybe they're going to turn, or they're not slowing down, so I'm going to start walking, and then they cut the turn anyway, and you get smacked. So dedicated right turn lanes reduced the uncertainty and therefore improved our safety rates. Sidewalk width. This is a huge one. How many of you think wider sidewalks are safer? Don't be embarrassed. I know it's kind of a trick question, but don't be embarrassed. I did too. That was one of the reasons we threw the variable in there. I thought, oh, if we have those nice big wide boulevard 10-foot sidewalks, that's going to be safer. What we actually found is, because of travel behavior, when people have a nice 10-foot wide sidewalk, they may be sauntering down the road, talking to their friend, and they walk right out into traffic and get hit. Whereas if we have a wider sidewalk that narrows as it approaches the intersection, and you have a nice small narrow sidewalk as you get close to that crosswalk, it's a lot safer, because just like traffic calming works for cars, when we narrow the roadway or we put in bulb outs to slow people down, it does the same thing for pedestrians. As you narrow the sidewalk, people become more aware and they slow down and they start to pay attention. And so by narrowing the sidewalks as you approach a crossing, you can actually make the intersection safer. Street trees. The presence of street trees was significantly correlated to a reduction in crashes. So areas like these beautiful tree-lined streets in East Salt Lake had significantly fewer crashes. And this is across the board. This was the whole county. So keep in mind, we're not just looking at certain areas, which could also be a confounding factor. We're looking across the board. So this is even in, you know, West Valley City, West Jordan, South Jordan. If there were street trees present, intersections were safer surrounding those areas. And a lot of that, again, traffic calming. People pay more attention. They slow down. They take in their environment when there's landscaping versus when it's a nice big wide open road with nothing to block your vision. You know, there's buildings on each side and you can just go down the street. So, and then the last one, this is kind of, again, a no-brainer. Construction is bad for bikes. because when you cone off the bike lane or the right-of-way where the bikes are supposed to ride, you immediately shove them out into traffic. And I don't know if I have it in this presentation, or no, I don't think I put it in this one. I have a picture where they're doing shoulder work, and the shoulder is 10 feet wide, and then all of a sudden there's a big orange cone, and there is no shoulder. And so if you're riding your bike down that road, suddenly you get to the big orange cone, and you get shoved into a travel lane. And if the cars aren't paying attention, because why would the cars pay attention? It's shoulder work. It's not impacting their lane. And all of a sudden, a bike jets out right in front of their car when they're going 45, 50 miles an hour. That makes for a very serious accident. And we have higher crash ratings across the board. Again, anytime there was construction happening at the time of the accident, that raised the risk of the intersection being classified as high risk. So then we move into our suburban zone. So we're out of the urban core now. We're out of the Salt Lake Valley, right in the Salt Lake Valley, and we're moving out to the suburbs. So this is Weber, Davis, and Utah counties. And what we found is that roadway width made a bigger difference in the more suburban areas. How wide the roadway was and the number of through lanes, not necessarily total lanes. So if we had a dedicated left or two dedicated lefts and a dedicated right, that didn't make as big of a difference as the number of lanes that were continuing through the intersection. Which again, these can be cross-correlated, but when we ran them independently, they still popped up as both being significant. So wider roadways, more through lanes, very significant indicators. One funny thing that we ran is Scott Jones with Safety Division, he didn't believe me that they weren't giving people enough time to cross, and that this was why roadway width was such a big factor. But we did the math on 3 of the high-risk intersections in Davis County, and to cross the width of the roadway on the amount of time that they were giving with the signal, you would have to be walking a 4.5 mile an hour pace. How many of you ever walked on a treadmill at a 4.5 mile an hour pace? Yeah, that's like where your hips are going to give out if you don't start jogging. And so that's how fast you would have to cross the road to make it on the green signal at 3 of our high-risk intersections in Davis County. I can tell you, the day after I made that known, they changed the signal timing at those 3 intersections because it was just a standard formula. And so when we're not thinking about these things and we think, oh, that's plenty of time. That's enough time for the cars to clear the intersection. Yes, but is it enough time for those poor people that are taking their life in their hands to try to cross on foot or to cross on a bike? And heaven help you if you entered the intersection after the light immediately turned green. So if it turned green and you were 10 feet behind and then tried to cross, you're stuck in the middle of the road when the light turns yellow, and then you've got all these through lanes again that are trying to beat the red light, and so you get hit and increases crash rate. So green turn arrows were another big problem in the suburbs, because what we see is, getting back to travel behavior, when you're a driver and you have a green arrow, what are you taught in driver's ed? Go, you have the right of way, green arrow, it's a protected left turn, right? Yeah, but green, you have the right of way, protected left turn. How many people are paying attention to what's right here? Most of the time when you're driving, you're paying attention to what's right here, not what's in the lanes you're going to be turning into. And so what we found is when there was a dedicated green arrow at an intersection, the crash risk for bicycles and pedestrian was significantly higher. Yeah?
They have the green arrow, the bike's supposed to stop at the red light. That's the problem, they don't stop.
And that gets into cyclist travel behavior or pedestrian travel behavior. That how many times, okay, so let's go with this one. You're a cyclist and you're coming up, and how many cyclists blow through those? A lot. Okay, I've done it before too. I'm not going to claim to be infallible. But as a pedestrian, you see this direction of traffic and this direction of traffic is stopped. You think you have the right of way because nobody pays attention to the blinking hand that says stop. And so you say, wow, traffic is stopped. I have the right of way. You take 4 steps into the street and a car turning left on a green arrow hits you. So again, it's a travel behavior problem, but it's also a systems problem, because we're creating the system where people aren't yielding because they've been trained not to. They've been trained that I have a green arrow, I can go, I have the right of way. And then non-residential drives within 100 meters. This is kind of one of those, again, no-brainers when you think of it in hindsight. The more access points you have near an intersection, the more potential there is for vehicles to do kind of stupid things, if you will. So from an engineering standpoint, you have the upstream and the downstream portion of the roadway. And how many times, if you're turning onto the roadway from right here and you're going to go right, what's the first thing you do as you pull out? Because traffic's coming this direction. So what do when you pull out into the roadway? You speed up. You slam on the gas so that you don't get rear-ended by all of the people coming towards you. But what happens when you do that right next to an intersection? You turn and you speed up so you don't get rear-ended, and you may be speeding up right into a pedestrian that's in a crosswalk. And yeah, granted, the pedestrian probably shouldn't be in the crosswalk if the light is green, but pedestrians do stupid things, you know. So we see that when we have more entrances and exits in these portions of the intersection within 100 meters, the crash risk goes up significantly. Whereas if we can pull back those access points, then it's safer, there's more visibility, pedestrians can kind of see who's entering the roadway, and it's a lot safer all across the board. Yeah? Touche. No, I'll give you that one because this is where we're going, and my last slide of my presentation gets into pedestrian travel behavior, because we've had so many meetings with safety where everybody's like, come on, you know, the pedestrians aren't obeying the signals. We can put the signals in, but if they're ignoring them, what are we supposed to do? You can only design for safety to a certain point, and then if no one's paying attention, they're going to be at an increased risk anyway. Yeah. Well, they're supposed to, they just don't. Well, if you're a cyclist and you blow a red light and you get hit, it's still your fault. It's the cyclist's fault. Well, I wouldn't make a blanket statement. I'd say there are a certain group of cyclists that behave that way. There are definitely, I would say, the large majority who are cautious and careful. But the point I'm trying to get at today is there are design steps that we can take to make an intersection safer, so that even when people aren't necessarily following the rules of the road all the time, we can design it in a way to impact their travel behavior, to encourage them to make decisions that result in more safety across the board, if that is a politically correct enough way of saying that. So now getting into the newer research. This is phase 3. So this is once we get off of the Wasatch Front. I put the maps in for this one just because I haven't presented on this area before, and I wanted you to see where the high-risk intersections are. So here's Cache County. All of the high-risk intersections in Cache County were in Logan or North Logan, and so that's why the scale of the map is more zoomed in than county-wide. But you can see that there are clusters right here along Main Street, and then 4th North going up to Utah State are huge areas for conflict. You have a lot more vehicle traffic, more level of service with regards to vehicles, and so there's more of an opportunity for there to be an crash between a vehicle and a pedestrian or a cyclist. Tooele County, again, we had one high-risk intersection in Grantsville and one in, this is, help me someone, what's the name of this town? Stansbury. And then going into Tooele. And 2 of those high-risk intersections are back-to-back right in front of the Walmart Supercenter as you come in off the highway. And I went out there to actually view that, and it's pretty scary. That's one of those places where you need almost a pedestrian overpass because no one should be crossing that road on foot. But you can see, again, there's clusters within these areas. Washington County, if you're familiar with Washington County, these are kind of the usual suspects. You've got Sunset Boulevard out, getting closer to Snow Canyon, then coming down Bluff Street, down on 7th South, St. George Boulevard, and then up in Washington as you exit the freeway. And again, higher levels of service, more automobile traffic. These are kind of the main thoroughfares. And that was the biggest result that we found from these areas off the Wasatch Front. Along the Wasatch Front and in Salt Lake County, we saw a lot more across the board, if you will. There wasn't as much clustering for high-risk intersections, with the exception of Redwood Road. That's a very bad place to bike or walk. But they're kind of evenly dispersed. Once you get off the Wasatch Front, there's a lot more patterning and clustering of where these crashes are taking place. And then if you look at Moab City, it's all on Main Street. All of their crashes, I don't even know if there was a bicycle and pedestrian crash located. There was probably one located off of Main Street. So if you ride anywhere in Moab, stay off Main Street and you're in good shape. Yeah. Well, it's higher level of service. It's your roads that are wider, bigger, meant to accommodate more traffic, and the roads that have higher vehicle traffic and more, daily vehicle traffic. Okay. Yeah, so more traffic, more vehicles on the road, and in a lot of cases, even if the vehicle traffic was lower, the roads that are designed at certain level of service were still significantly high. So the findings for this one, again, these are a little bit more intuitive. And so if I asked one of you, what do you think makes an intersection more dangerous or safer for bicyclists and pedestrians? And you'd start naming things off the top of your head. Those were kind of the ones that boiled to the top for this area. In Salt Lake County, again, some of them like street trees. Wow, we didn't really think the street trees would be a significant factor when it came to safety, but it is for Salt Lake County. And some of the suburban ones were a little bit, more unusual. But when we got into these areas off of the Wasatch Front, things were more intuitive. Crashes were clustered along the main corridors, and speed was a big factor. The speed limit of the roadway was significantly correlated to the number of cyclist and pedestrian crashes that were located there. So again, those main thoroughfares, the main streets that have the higher speed limits, that's where we saw the majority of our crashes. Demographics, once we get off the Wasatch Front, demographics, like that question earlier, significantly correlated to crash risk. If an intersection is located in an area with a high population under the age of 18, crash rates go through the roof. Because again, here's one example. This is an intersection on 700 South in St. George next to Dixie High School. It was one of the most dangerous intersections in Washington County because you've got high school kids driving and high school kids crossing the road, and there's a very high population of young people around that school. So you may have, elementary age kids walking to and from school, combine that with the high school kids driving, and it was very significant. Then also lower income areas had significantly more non-motorized crashes. So the more affluent areas didn't have the high-risk intersections. The lower income areas is where we really saw this clustering. There is the potential for a small confound there that I will fess up to, because a lot of times the property values and the income of the individual living near those major thoroughfares and the higher volume streets are lower, because if you can afford to not live on the busy street, you probably would move away from it. And so there's the potential for that confound. But we did find these two demographics correlated, whereas along the Wasatch Front, demographics had absolutely no impact. So kind of an interesting finding. Intersection characteristics. The number of lanes, again, was very significant for pedestrians especially. Roadways with more lanes were significantly more dangerous. Each additional lane that you added to a roadway's right-of-way resulted in about 2 additional non-motorized crashes at that location. And you may think like, oh, 2 crashes, that's not a lot. But it is when we're talking about 11 crashes over a 6-year period. Increasing that by 2 is very significant. Also, this is kind of a funny one, and one that we're still trying to figure out a little bit, so I appreciate your brainstorming with me, because I have my hypothesis of why this is the case, but I may be totally wrong, and I'm open to that possibility. The presence of bike lanes is correlated to more pedestrian crashes. So if there's a bike lane on a road, it's actually significantly more dangerous for pedestrians to cross that road. And we all laughed at first, saying like, oh yeah, maybe they're getting hit by the bikes. You know, it's those dang cyclists hitting the pedestrians. But then what we realized is if you have a roadway that looks like this, that has a nice park strip, bike lanes, if you're a pedestrian, you're crossing the street, you may be like 12 feet into the roadway and into the crosswalk before you even hit that first lane of travel with vehicles. And so if you're a car, and pretend there's a car parked here, and then you've got the bike lane, you might not even see that pedestrian coming. And the pedestrian thinks like, I'm already 10 feet into the road, I'm good to go, and they keep walking. And the cars don't even see them until it's too late. And so I think it's more of a visibility issue than a width or the presence of the bike lane in and of itself, but it's that buffer and that decreased visibility for pedestrians that is created by adding that additional distance. And again, I'm one to admit I could be completely wrong. If you have a better hypothesis, please share it with me.
Did you find something similar for wide shoulders versus those that were striped for bike lanes?
No, because in a lot of these areas, the shoulders through these main street, main corridors where our high-risk intersections were, most of those areas don't have real wide shoulders. And especially, like in Moab or in St. George, where they do have enough shoulder, they've striped a bike lane. And so it could be that if we found areas with wider shoulders, we may find the same result, but we just didn't have them in these areas. Signal characteristics. Left turn lanes, not green arrows, but just having a left turn lane at an intersection made it more dangerous. And again, this is probably more of a problem with pedestrian travel behavior, where they come up to the crosswalk, they think they're clear, they start walking, and someone turning left turns into them. So, and with this, because we're dealing with, areas like Moab and areas like Logan, they don't necessarily have the preponderance of left turn arrows that we get when we look at the Wasatch Front. And so it may be a left turn lane where there should be a left turn arrow, or it's the same kind of a situation, but the left turn arrows, there just weren't enough of them for it to show up as significant. So how do we deal with this? I will say that for these areas, it's a lot easier to plan for bicycle and pedestrian safety off the Wasatch Front. Because when you look at where our high-risk intersections are, these are corridor treatments. All you have to do is fix Main Street, and you've basically eliminated your risk, right? Or you can at least drop your numbers significantly because you're only dealing with one area. It's a lot more complex when we get into Salt Lake County and Weber, Davis, Utah counties, because they're more spread out. We don't have that clustering. But in the more rural counties, it's kind of easy. You can pick your 3 main roads, pound your investment into those corridors, and drastically improve safety. Changing pedestrian travel behavior. We've already talked about this. Pedestrians, a lot of the time, just do not pay attention. We're all guilty of it. And now with the presence, I can't even tell you, when I went out to the sites to do the inventories, how many people I saw walking into the crosswalk with headphones on, or texting, or tweeting, or checking in on Foursquare, like, I'm in the crosswalk right now. They can't put their phones down, and so they're not paying attention, and they may not even know they're hit until it's too late, because they're just not focusing. And so looking at more of a pedestrian information campaign, how do we teach the pedestrians how to behave appropriately to improve their own safety? Improving some of our call buttons. Instead of just having, the typical silver button that we push saying, I'm here, I want to cross the road, what if we add some of the informational signage to say, when the hand is flashing, you need to stop. Like, that's a bad time to cross the road. If you have a countdown, don't enter the roadway when you have 3 seconds left, unless you're Usain Bolt and you think you can make it all the way across. Be aware and cross with care. Giving people more information, making things more visible, allowing people that opportunity to be reminded that they need to think safely. And caution watch for vehicles. How many times do we see signs like this? Most of the time you'll see a watch for pedestrians, pay attention. But we also need to be educating our pedestrians, especially as non-motorized modes become more prevalent for transportation. We plan for vehicle transportation and for transit, but how much time do we spend thinking about educating people who are walking for transportation? We need to be a little bit more mindful and, if you will, dumb it down a little bit. Yeah, Dave.
I think some of it comes down to, we talk about driver expectation on roads so that they come to an intersection, they understand what's going on. I know that some signals, and I forgot which city, I think it's Salt Lake, and some signals, the countdown, it'll count down and then you have 10 more seconds. And some of you count down, you have no more time. And so I think consistency there, if I walk enough and I know I have 10 seconds after it goes to 0, I'm going to, okay, yeah, I can make it.
It says 2, but I still really have 12.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kevin.
I used to live in an area that had a number of elementary schools, which translates into a lot of crossing guards. And one behavior that I observed, if you read the manual on how they're supposed to do it, the job of the crossing guard is to collect the kids on the side of the street, find a break in the traffic, stop the traffic, and then take them across. And invariably, the crossing guards
stops traffic for every
stopping
single kid that gets
and just waving the kids on. And you're right, the kids do not look at the traffic. They completely trust that crossing guard, and we're training them to do what you just described before. Earplugs in and just walk right in.
That's true. Yeah. There's a lot of research on those from Europe, but in the United States we kind of shy away from that type of design, and so there's not a lot of research here. You'd be hard pressed to name 5 examples where that even exists in the United States. They're just not common. Huh? No, I would love to see them everywhere, honestly, and I would love to get rid of 4-foot sidewalks across the board. I think that one of the, and this is personal opinion and my experience talking, but I think that the subdivision ordinance that requires the 4-foot sidewalk whenever you put in houses, I think it's horrible. I think we need to get away from that and look at more context-sensitive design and what's actually appropriate for the area. Leading into the intersection, that doesn't mean that in the neighborhoods and along the boulevards you can have wider sidewalks as long as you do an appropriate treatment as you approach the intersection so that you're not providing a nice ramp right into traffic. But I want to follow this up and then we can do some questions at the end. Changing driver behavior, we talk about this all the time, and this is probably something more of us are familiar with, but these signs, watch for pedestrians, the school zone signs, the crossing signs, we're seeing more of the these little pillars have become incredibly popular in the last few years, and you see those popping up all over the place to remind drivers that this is a crosswalk, there might be people here, like it's a news flash that people might want to cross the street. Also, improving things like state law. You need to stop on this line. Reminding people in context, giving them those constant reminders, putting in hawk signals, putting in the overhead lights so that when someone pushes a button to cross the street, traffic is alerted rather than, well, there's a crosswalk, so I should have the right of way, but the cars may not even see the crosswalk. Mid crossings or pedestrian refuges are fantastic, especially considering that in all 3 areas, the width of the roadway and the number of lanes was a significant factor in crash risk. And so, perhaps we need to start looking at installing a few more of those pedestrian refuges so that if someone who does maybe have limited mobility or who doesn't make it all the way across, give them somewhere safe to stand rather than in a turn lane until they can make it the rest of the way across. And then they're not trying to shoot the gap and beat the traffic across. The last thing I want to mention is the Utah Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. In Utah, crashes and fatalities for vehicle traffic have actually been going down over the last 10 years. But for pedestrians, the fatality number has actually been increasing. We haven't seen a decrease in pedestrian fatalities, and last year was actually one of the deadliest years in Utah history for pedestrians on the roadway. And so last year, the UDOT Safety Division and the Office of Highway Safety put together a task force to figure out how can we improve pedestrian safety. Cyclists are important too, but they were really emphasizing pedestrian safety. And so we got together and we created the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. And what this does is it goes agency by agency and lists a number of strategies and kind of a checklist of things that all of the agencies in the state are going to do to improve pedestrian safety. It's available, and I have a PDF that I could send you if you're interested in looking at it. We're still fine-tuning it a little bit, and so it's not available on UDOT's website yet, but it will be soon within the next month. And so if that's something that you're interested in looking at, it's going to have a lot of strategies for UDOT moving forward. There's going to be a guidebook that's going to go out to all of the regions, like a checklist, if you will, that happens during the preliminary planning and scoping phases of projects, where they're going down the list of the things they need to be doing to accommodate pedestrian safety. Additionally, we're going to be putting together a toolbox for local municipalities. So if you're a city engineer and you want to know how to improve pedestrian safety in your city, we're going to be putting together a toolbox, if you will, some best practices, ordinances, example ordinances that you can use to implement some of these best practices within your area. And it's a 5-year plan. And so all of the checklist items and all of the action items within this plan will be accomplished by 2020. And hopefully that will make a significant difference in accommodating pedestrian safety. But with that, we'll open it up to questions, and I'm happy to stick around for a little bit and answer if you don't want to ask a question in front of the group, if you just have something you want to talk about. But George.
Sean, you mentioned the bicycle compatibility index not being totally in line with the crash reduction or a safety factor. Which elements didn't line up? You mentioned speed, which is one of the major factors of BCI.
Well, BCI, and then there's a bicycle friendliness level, something that they had an intern that went and did every single road in Salt Lake County. And so we actually have, we have numbers. It's fantastic. We have the data. But what we found, truck traffic is another thing that they take into consideration. Shoulder, number of lanes, level of service, traffic volumes, et cetera, et cetera. Is there on-street parking? I mean, there's probably 50 variables that go into these indices. And we didn't look at every single variable within the indices. We just ran the indices to see how they correlated. And so it could have been any number of the variables within each index. And I just didn't have the manpower. And we didn't, honestly, statistically, we didn't have enough degrees of freedom with our sample size to be able to run that many variables in the model. So.
But just beware then.
Just beware that if you're looking at a bicycle friendliness index or a compatibility index, that doesn't necessarily equate to safety. It may mean it's more comfortable for a cyclist to ride on that type of a road based on the different types of cyclists, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a very safe place or a very safe environment. Yeah. Which city? Salt Lake County, 4100 South and 4700 South in West Valley on Redwood Road. Those two intersections are the most deadly intersections in the entire state for a bike ped. And they're back to back. It's 2 stoplights in a row. It's a rate based on the volumes that we had, but it's also it also holds true total number of crashes over this study time period. So, yeah.
Will the city and the city is going to eliminate some crosswalks because of the
Yeah, and I'm not a huge, I mean, mid-block crossings are great in some, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a case-by-case situation. You know, you could, no, and that's part of the problem that we're running into is because this is gaining so much momentum, everybody wants to throw guidelines out there of what should be done, and a lot of times they're in conflict with one another. Like best practices don't always line up with what the guidelines say, and you know, we all know that you kind of have to go off of MUTCD and some of those, you know, standards that trump standards that trump standards, and then you end up creating kind of a perfect storm for a hot mess. And so I think we're still trying to sort that out, and it's one of the reasons that UDOT is going to be creating some best practices and looking at creating, you know, sample ordinances and guidelines and checklists so that then we're all on the same page and we're all doing the same thing within the confines of what's required. Yeah.
During your study, did you find that signs that were directed at pedestrians had significant impact on the number of crashes with pedestrians? It seems like pedestrians ignore signals just as much as they ignore signs, and additional signage would really help the problem.
You know, in most of the areas that we looked at, there weren't pedestrian signs. Like, I would say pretty much across the board in Utah, there's not a preponderance of pedestrian informational signs. It's getting a little bit better, and again, in, you know, the usual suspects, Park City's fantastic. And that's why we don't have a huge high-risk crash, you know, study going on in Park City, because it's relatively safe, you know, rate-wise when you look at the rest of the region. Salt Lake City's doing great things, the county's been doing great things, but there's just not, I mean, most cities are struggling with funding, and the last thing the city wants to put into the budget, let's be honest, is pedestrian signage. You know, that's not real high up the budget list. Let's put out signs telling pedestrians they need to watch where they're going. You know, it seems like, well, no, they should know that they need to watch where they're going. But, you know, there's only so many dollars to do great things. So, good, better, best. Any other questions?
Was the pedestrian increase on pet crashes on bike lanes, was that mid-block or at intersections?
At intersections. Yeah, so. Well, thank you all for coming. If you have very specific questions or want to chat for a minute, I'll be around for a second, and you guys have a great week. Thank you.